All right, we're gonna get started. Hey folks, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro. We're here for another amazing week on A Mighty Blaze. I'm Mark Cecil, as always. I'm a writer, I'm an editor, I'm a journalist, and I'm here to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great writers tick, and here to support authors who are bringing out new books with big ideas in them. A few quick notes about how this is gonna work. We're live on the Facebook page of A Mighty Blaze right now. If you have a question for Seth Abramson, our author today, please put it in the chat, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can by the end of the call. Next week, I'm going to be on with Henriette Lazaridis and Rory Power. They are a mother-daughter novelist combo. We'll be discussing Henriette's and Rory's latest books, and we'll just kind of pick apart what it's like to be inside of kind of a successful mother-daughter novelist relationships. They're really cool people, and it's going to be a fun kind of joint interview. And then I just want to, before we get started, and I might be speaking fast because, oh my God, we have so much to get to with Seth today. But I just want to plug A Mighty Blaze. We're a collection of authors who got together when COVID started to try to help people whose book tours had been canceled. We are here every week with not just my interviews, but dozens of other interviews week after week with authors who are pubbing, just to try to, help them reach readers in a way that they might have before the pandemic. So, as my kids say, smash that like button, try to follow A Mighty Blaze, and like other videos that we do, because all of it is supporting authors. So I want to get on to this week and our guest today. It is a great privilege and very, very excited to have Seth Abramson here. So for those who don't know Seth, Seth is a political columnist for Newsweek. He's a professor of journalism and legal advocacy at the University of New Hampshire. He's a regular contributor to both CNN and the BBC, and he was named as one of the National Council for the Training of Journalists lists of most respected journalists in the United States and the UK. He's one of only 9 freelancers to be honored in that way. He was trained as a criminal investigator. He has degrees from Georgetown University and Harvard, and also the Iowa Writers Workshop. So Seth is perhaps best known for his epic Twitter feed, where he has over 850,000 followers. And on his Twitter feed, and we're going to get into this in a moment, he's pioneered a method of reporting called curatorial journalism, or also called meta-journalism. He's written 2 books already about the Trump administration. The first was in 2018. It was called Proof of Collusion. The next was a year later. It was called Proof of Conspiracy. And now he's back with the third and final book in the trilogy, which was just released. It's called Proof of Corruption, Bribery, Impeachment, and Pandemic in the Age of Trump. NPR called the book a searing indictment of Trump's brazen behavior in office and its dire consequences to the world. Seth Abramson, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Awesome. All right, Seth. So first of all, do you have a copy of the book that you could hold up? Boom. There it is. Great. All right. So Seth, just take a moment and just tell us what the book is about.
So as you said, this is the 3rd book in a 2,500-page meta-journalistic nonfiction epic about Donald Trump's foreign policy. And what it does in the 3 books, and specifically in Proof of Corruption, the most recent one, is it charts the courses of collusion, quid pro quos, between Donald Trump and a number of nations. And the list is quite a long one, because Donald Trump has the same practice in every country that he's doing foreign policy agendas with: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, Venezuela. Particularly the last items on those lists, the last 5 or 6 are in Proof of Corruption. And what I show in the book is that it's the same pattern every time. Donald Trump is trading US foreign policy in exchange for personal benefit, either election aid or some sort of financial benefit. And so the 3 books, and Proof of Corruption specifically, take you through these courses of collusion, with a particular focus in Proof of Corruption on Ukraine, China, Turkey, Israel, and Venezuela.
Got it. Okay, so we're going to get into a lot of aspects of this book, including how it was reported, how you put it together, and also the substance of the book. But I just want to promise everybody who's listening that we are going to get to some more current events things at the end. I mean, obviously the passing of Justice Ginsburg and the integrity of our election are 2 top of mind issues for everybody. And Seth has just been all over those issues, and frankly, beating a lot of people to the punch on Twitter on those. So I do want to engage Seth on some stuff in the news right now, but for the first part of the interview, we're going to focus on the book. And so to that end, Seth, I just want to turn back, and you are a very interesting guy and a very interesting writer. I mean, on your webpage, you have poems that you've written. I mean, you're a poetry anthology editor, you're a creative writer by training. You went to Iowa Writers Workshop. So for those who don't know, that's like playing basketball for Duke. Is like you go to the Iowa Writers Workshop for creative writing. It's like it's the preeminent place to get educated in that way in this country. So Seth is just kind of very well decorated and experienced as a creative writer, and yet here you are writing nonfiction about Trump. I'm just wondering, can you just give me the brief thumbnail? How did you get pulled into writing political nonfiction?
So I teach digital writing among a number of other subjects, journalism, legal advocacy, and so on, at University of New Hampshire. And one of the things I do in teaching digital writing is I teach it inductively rather than deductively. And what that means is simply this. I teach students that your public communications practice is built up from everything you are, everything you've ever done, your knowledge bases, your skill sets, your triumphs, your traumas, your personality, your temperament, and so on. And so I bring everything I've done in the past as an editor, as a poet, as a professor, as an attorney, as a journalist, to everything that I do writing-wise. There's no writing I do that doesn't draw on every skill set. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to write poetry, which is of course condensed, restricted language, will understand how useful that is to writing on Twitter, for instance, right? The skill of a poet very much shows up in writing on Twitter. What I was doing in poetry, actually, at the tail end of writing 6 poetry books, was I was doing a lot of literary remixing in poetry. Well, you see how that sort of curation of sources shows up in the Proof series, which is a nonfiction series. But I'll tell you that more specifically in 2015, on the day that Donald Trump announced his candidacy, I was writing as a columnist for the Huffington Post, and I wrote a column about Donald Trump the day he announced, because at that point I was focused on cultural theory, Donald Trump as a theoretical phenomenon within our culture that was now emerging into politics. And that's where my writing with Donald Trump started, as a sort of academic. And then it moved to a realization that there was so much great investigative journalism all around the world, going back years, on Donald Trump as the campaign unfolded in 2015, 2016, that someone needed to curate it and compile it. It was such a daunting task that I didn't want to do it for a few years. I finally folded in mid-2018 and wrote Proof of Collusion.
Got it. All right. So I want to take a moment. I really want people to focus on this part of the interview, because this is about the method, the unique and pioneering method by which this book was written. And I just want to go over it because it's important for people who might not be familiar. I'm just going to briefly run through what curatorial journalism is. And so you defined it in an essay you wrote, and I just want to go through. You said it has 5 qualities. Number 1, it boosts conventional journalism that might have gotten lost in the shuffle. Number 2, it shows that different pieces of journalism actually dovetail together in ways that the authors might not be aware of. Number 3, it highlights what is truly newsworthy within any single piece of journalism. Number 4, it offers a roadmap to kind of the best institutions and best journalists. And number 5, and I think this is the key point, this meta-journalistic technique, it synthesizes and creates narrative, not creates, but sort of reveals narratives that that would not be visible unless you were looking at all the data at once. And Seth and I were sort of talking before the call how this is similar to big data, and it's like sort of like the main kind of things, factors that drive big data, and kind of like once you are able to kind of compile and sift through a big, huge amount of data, you can get new things, new products, new ideas that were unavailable to you before. And I just want to read one last quote from you, which says, "I became a meta-journalist at the beginning of the Trump era, not because I believed there was too little excellent conventional news reporting, but because there was too much." And so you are sort of there connecting the dots for everybody. So first, I just want to say, like, feel free to correct me if I misrepresented that in any way, but I'm just kind of, the pointed question I want to ask you is, why is now the time for meta-journalism? Like, why not in 2010? Why not in 2000? Why did it come about now?
Well, I think that one thing we've seen with Donald Trump is that it is part of his political strategy to produce the maximum amount of news, and also, frankly, the maximum amount of disorientation on a daily basis. He wants to keep the media sort of wrong-footed at all times, and frankly, American voters also. And so from the moment Donald Trump emerged on the political landscape, we were overwhelmed with, as journalists, so much to write about. And conventional journalism actually did a great job. Again, this is not just domestically, but internationally. There were so many incredible pieces of investigative journalism on Donald Trump that the issue was, as I said, that there was too much, not in the sense of there should have been less, but there was too much for any one person to process. There needed to be an intermediary. There needed to be a meta-journalist. So meta-journalism is the overarching concept. Curatorial journalism is the method that falls underneath that overarching concept. And the idea is that you have to have someone who is seeing the whole landscape of stories going back decades, written domestically, internationally, from high quality, reliable media outlets. And someone has to compile, curate, and connect those stories by simply putting them next to each other. I think what I said to you earlier, Mark, and what I'll say to everyone now, is that ultimately this work will be done by AI and blockchain. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you're going to have a sort of neurojournalism that creates a cluster of reporting that is non-hierarchical, but fully informs people on a given subject by saying, if you read these 6 articles, you're going to understand this subcategory of information within this news story, rather than right now what we get with Google, which is a hierarchical, this is the most important, this is the second most important, and so on. Why didn't this happen earlier? Well, it could have probably happened 10 years ago. I think Donald Trump hastened it, but just the technology with digital publication of news, there's been a proliferation of digital media outlets and therefore a proliferation of news. Also, we have better access to international journalism than we ever did before. So that even more exponentially increased the amount of news that we have available. And so, Donald Trump was the straw that broke the camel's back, essentially. But meta-journalism probably should have kicked off if journalism hadn't been so, frankly, culturally retrograde and resistant to the digital age. I think 10 years ago, we would have had this, but I'm right now doing by hand, Mark, what ultimately will be done by computers. But this is an emergency. It's a national emergency, so someone has to do it, even if it's grueling emotionally and physically, which I can tell you it was.
Yeah, I know you've said that after this trilogy, you want to go back to writing something completely different, and I do understand why. And I just want to tell people the experience of reading this book is like, it's really pleasurable, and it's actually very fast paced. I mean, Seth was talking earlier about, the skills of poetry and kind of working with strict confines. I mean, so I think the book is 500 pages long, and you have like 500 pages of notes, but I mean, you just zipped through, chapter after chapter. They're very condensed and very lucid at the same time. And just to give people an idea, there's obviously tons and tons and tons of footnotes. Can you just talk to us for a second about those footnotes? Because I know how important transparency is to you. You've posted those footnotes online. Tell us about what that is and why.
Yeah, so for proof of collusion, the footnotes were actually published in the book. But ultimately, what we wanted to move to for proof of conspiracy, which was in 2019, and now proof of corruption in 2020, is that the endnotes for those 2 books are available for free online on the Macmillan website 24/7, 365. The whole purpose of meta-journalism is that it should happen in public. It should be 100% transparent, what sources I'm using, what information I'm getting from them. So yeah, proof of corruption is 576 pages, and then there's 440 pages of endnotes online. So the book in total is over 1,000 pages. The proof series in total is over 2,500 pages with 12,000 sources. Proof of corruption itself has 5,000 sources. But Mark, let me say, one of the reasons that the book is so fast-paced is that you're not reading a paragraph that I wrote in the way that I do when I'm writing fiction, or when I'm writing creative nonfiction, or when I teach students to write fiction or creative nonfiction. What you're seeing are sentences that are a distillation, each one of them almost, a distillation of a news article into its most salient, newsworthy point. And so you're getting a sort of hardened nub of information, high nutrient news, with almost every single sentence. That's why it feels like it's moving so quickly, because you're actually jumping, even in one paragraph, you're jumping from source to source. My job as the curator is to not make it feel like you're doing that, to have it feel like this is a single coherent nonfiction epic. And I think most people feel that it is, but it does read differently because of how it was constructed.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's something that I'd never quite thought of before until you shined a light on it, which is that how much of even the most blockbuster news story is filled with kind of like context and flavor and kind of like situating the information for the reader and suggesting what the implications might be. But like, it might just be that like the true hard news, like core of that story could be summarized in a single sentence. And that's kind of what shows up in your book.
Yeah, and if I can tell you where that comes from. So I started my legal career as an investigator at Georgetown University. I was attending Dartmouth at the time. I got trained as an investigator and practiced as an investigator at Georgetown. But when I went to law school and then when I practiced law for a number of years, one of the things any law student will tell you is you're trained to look at what's called the holding of any published court decision. And that's usually one sentence or maybe two sentences from a really long published court opinion that is the part that matters. It's the part that changes things fundamentally. And what I determined, remember I said in digital writing, you take every aspect of your past and you put it together. When I read journalism, I find myself as a lawyer and a former criminal investigator looking for the holding of that piece of journalism. What's the piece that moves the ball? What's the piece that I couldn't find anywhere else because it's unreplicable? Then I only select that piece and I put it next to another piece from another story that maybe was written in a different country and 2 years ago. And I show that by putting them next to each other, you can see the sort of synaptic connections between the two of them. That's why sometimes I think of this as neurojournalism. But what you're getting in each case is effectively the holding of each article, rather than, as you said, all the filler, all the rehashing. But I make sure there's enough of that, of course, in the book so that people know what's happening. But the goal is to have the maximum number of sentences that are the unreplicable, high nutrient news from individual news stories.
Right. It's like all protein, no mashed potatoes, no gravy, just protein.
That's the goal. Yeah.
So, and folks who are listening, we are going to get to the substance of the book, but I do think it's important to talk about these methods. I think the methods are important to discuss, and they are pioneering in their way. So, Seth, are there others who are meta-journalists as well? I know you're one of the main figures here, but are there others?
Well, there are others right now who are doing it in multimedia. I think it was seen as being almost a contradiction in terms and maybe a little bit too difficult to do to reduce meta-journalism, which is fundamentally a digital strategy, as I said, that will be done by AI and blockchain eventually, to reduce that to paper, which is what I did. The people doing it in multimedia are very well-known people. I mean, John Oliver, who does a nightly show on HBO, just won another Emmy. And fundamentally, people don't realize necessarily, the reason John Oliver is so compelling is that he's giving you these highly concentrated meta-journalistic disquisitions on a single topic where he's drawing from many sources very quickly. Rachel Maddow does it on MSNBC. And when she started doing meta-journalism on a nightly basis, her show became one of the highest rated shows on MSNBC, if not the highest rated show on MSNBC. The question was, how do you get that information to people who don't watch HBO, don't get HBO, and don't watch MSNBC? A lot of people still read books. And so I wanted to take what is fundamentally an emerging digital journalism mode and see if I could reduce it to writing. And that's what I did in the Proof series.
Got it. And just a few more questions on this. So how do you, I think I saw a quote from you somewhere that you said you just sort of like generally accept the trustworthiness of news, conventional news sources. And I just, for my own part, this is exactly how I feel. I feel like truth is the currency of journalism. I was a journalist myself for many years, and I just feel like that is the only thing you can trade on as a journalist. You have no other card to play except your ability to generate the truth. And the consequences are severe by and large for journalists who are exposed for not telling the truth. And so I just want to say, like, I agree with this general principle, but one might say, like, obviously you have to draw the line, say, somewhere, right? Like, you're going to accept the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, but you were not going to accept, whatever. I'm just wondering, how do you make that distinction about what makes it into the meta narrative?
So every media outlet that appears in those 12,000 citations that the Proof series had to meet a sort of stress test. Several elements that had to be met regarding reliability, regarding its reporting being similar to or connected to information in other known reliable media outlets. This was particularly important because in some cases I was using international outlets. And so that stress test was absolutely vital. But also remember, Mark, on the back end, the transparency is there. You can look up every source that I'm using. And I think what people will find when they read if they look at the 1,000 pages right now that's online of sources for the Proof series, these are major media outlets. You don't want to take the chance of ever using a single author blog or someone or anyone who is publishing anything anonymously or anything that has no editorial oversight. You can see that there are all these elements of the stress test. So I have a great belief in conventional long-form investigative journalism at reliable major media outlets that have been around for a while, have an editorial structure, have non-anonymous authors that are speaking to events that can be then confirmed and connected to in other media outlets. But absolutely, a line has to be drawn. And then on the back end, readers have to be able to see my sources so that they can say, oh yeah, he's not using just some blog that happened to agree with what he, what I think he wanted to have in the book, which is usually a misperception. But here's the most important thing. When you're creating a neural network effectively of sources that are all speaking to each other because they're placed in a networked conversation with one another, and you can also refer to this as network reporting or networked reporting, you are creating such a large network that if one source, for some unexpected reason, were to be weaker than expected, it would not fundamentally change the contours of the network. So you talked about big data. One of the keys to big data is to create such a big network that even if you had one rotten or slightly rotten node in that network, which you hope will never happen, it would not bring down the system. And so when people say, what if you're wrong? What if these books are somehow wrong in the narrative that they're providing? The first thing I say is, well, first of all, it's not whether I'm wrong. These books are not my opinion. It's not a Jeremiad. It's not my rhetoric. It's a curatorial journalism. But also, if one data point out of the 12,000 were to turn out to be erroneous for some reason, it wouldn't change anything. And that's the purpose of creating a network this large.
Right. It's the network makes it stronger.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned somewhere like that. Have you? Let me just ask you the question. Have you ever had issues with being fact checked on your book? Issues coming up where people are saying like, look, I have found these weak points in these books. Has that happened?
So the series as a whole was fact checked by more than a dozen professional fact checkers at, I will tell you, enormous expense, right? This is a voluntary process that I went through and that I coordinated with the help of my agent, Jeff Silberman, to manage this team of professional fact checkers. And what you find with professional fact checkers is they'll sometimes say, look, you should change this verb a little bit, or we want to alter sort of how you're presenting this quote because we want to make sure the full context is being given. But did any one of my fact checkers across 3 years ever say, this is totally wrong? This is just, and not wrong like a typo that you have to fix, but this is just completely false. It didn't happen because I picked my sources, very, very carefully and ensured that wouldn't happen. One of the things that I just want to say very quickly is, some people who understand theory a little bit have heard the term postmodernism. I'm not a postmodernist. I'm a metamodernist, which is simply a way of saying, I get that everything's deconstructed and that everything's a mess, and I still want to wake up in the morning and have some hope. And so everything about this series, as distressing as it is, built into the process is a certain amount of hope that even though I'm curating all these sources and I'm showing that we're getting information from all over the place, you can still see meta narratives. You can still see that information speaks to other information. You can still see that there is sense to be made of things that seem like they are permanently atomized and deconstructed. And so I just want to note that aspect of optimism is part of my fundamental philosophy as an academic, as an author, and just as a person.
That's great to hear because it's been some dark days the last few days on your Twitter feed. So
it has been. I have relapses, Mark.
All right, we'll get to that in a minute. All right, now we're going to get onto your book. I hope people understand why I took a moment to set up how the book was created before we actually moved on to the book. So kind of pivoting into the content of the book, can you explain, like, is there news in a traditional sense in the book, or is the news sort of like revealed by these meta narratives, this network you've created, that is the news? Or is there actually some hard reporting in it? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, so there is hard reporting in it by other people, of course, that I'm curating, but there is news in two separate ways. The first type of news is the last one that you mentioned. There is news in the fact that when you put two sources next to each other that have never been put next to each other in any format, you immediately see the connections between the reporting that was being done in these far-flung environments. And you say, oh my gosh, light bulb goes on, it's news. Now, it's not news that has independently been reported because that moment of quote unquote news is happening in the syntactic gap, as it were, between those two news stories and your own realization of what they mean by being placed next to each other. But there's also news in another sense, and this is really important, Mark. My theory of there being not too little great investigative journalism from major media outlets around the world going back decades, but in fact, too much of it for anyone to process, is that even if you are an avid consumer of news, even if you think you know everything that's out there, I promise you the maximum amount you know is 20%. The other 80% is news to you because you've never seen it before. So when you're publishing a book like this, you're always going to have people in PR and marketing and editorial at your publisher who understandably ask you the very conventional questions. Hey, when we tell media about this book you've written, what's the news? What's no one has, what's the stuff that no one's ever seen before? And what I always say is there's no original reporting in the book, but almost the entirety of the book will be news to everyone who reads it. So I hope people understand the difference between the two, because the latter really is much more important. It's where the rubber meets the road of news consumption. If something is news to you, it is breaking news to you. And that's how we actually experience the news. Whether it's breaking news in some absolute sense is really immaterial to the average reader, because that doesn't affect your experience. So when people read the proof series, they come away and they say, my jaw was on the floor with every single page. Yet paradoxically, they also are reading things that were previously reported. And that sort of paradox is fundamental to meta-journalism. It's fundamental also, I will say, to meta-modernism, the sort of cultural theory that I study as an academic. The sort of generative paradoxes that we experience in the digital age are not seen as scary and debilitating, but as generative. And that's what I try to produce with my books.
Yeah, I had that very experience. You described it very well. That was my own experience as well. It's sort of like, yeah, I knew all these things already, but seeing them kind of crushed together in this way that, like, just fact after fact after fact, you're like, I knew that, but I forgot about that. I knew that, and I didn't think it was related to this, and so on and so forth. So I had a similar experience. But just to illustrate this idea, Seth, that you're talking about of these kind of like unexpected synapse connections, can you just give me a couple examples of like pieces of narrative that you end up together in your book that generate such news as you're describing?
Sure. Well, let's look at the chapter on Trump-China collusion. And I can tell a story that, between it maybe has just 15 data points, even though the Trump-China chapter has, I think, something like 350 different sources that are being used. Let's just take 12 to 15 of those, right? In June of 2019, Donald Trump directly says to Chinese President Xi Jinping, I want you to help me to win re-election in 2020. We get this from John Bolton. We also had prior reporting, though, that in June of 2019, or I'm sorry, I should say that Donald Trump at a face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping says, I want you to help me to win re-election by helping me with this trade deal. We're going to do a deal that's great for China, but that also helps me get re-election because I get the photo op essentially of saying that I did a big trade deal with China. That we get from John Bolton. We had prior reporting about a phone call in June of 2019 in which Donald Trump directly asks for Xi Jinping's help in a broad-based way to win re-election. All right, now the problem is that those trade negotiations that he thinks will help him get re-election do not come to fruition until December of 2019. And so it isn't until December 2019 that that deal is going to be consummated that Donald Trump thinks will help him gain re-election. Well, what happens in the interim? We have many reports of what happened in October 2019 when Donald Trump came out in public and said before the cameras, I have a lot of leverage on China right now because of these trade negotiations. And 30 seconds later, in that very same press conference, I think it was October 19th of 2019, 30 seconds later, he said, and here's what China should do. They should give me and the world dirt on Joe Biden and his family because it's out there. Well, then we have reporting from the Financial Times that within 96 hours, the Chinese actually gave non-public information about the Bidens to Michael Pillsbury, Donald Trump's trade representative, his top trade representative on the China trade deal. We then have 5 or 6 reports that tell us that a month later in November, US military intelligence provides the Trump White House and the Pentagon with proof positive that there is a major dangerous virus in Wuhan, in China, that is going to spread. It is going to be potentially apocalyptic. And the Trump White House rejects that intelligence, forcing our military to go to NATO and the Israel Defense Forces instead, because they couldn't get anyone in the White House to accept this information, this intelligence about China. Why? Because it would have disrupted the trade deal. So what happens in December is that the trade deal goes through. The Chinese slip in a pandemic clause that basically says all this is invalid if there's a pandemic. It's highly unusual. You would never expect that in a trade deal like this, but what does the Trump White House do? They don't object to that clause. Then Donald Trump tells us, I didn't know anything about any of this until January, or even late January, when the curatorial journalism shows us that Donald Trump was colluding over Joe Biden dirt and over a trade deal in 2019. And there appears to be a clear connection between that and the rejection of US military intelligence about this emerging virus. Upshot, America should have responded to the coronavirus 3 months earlier than it did, and it didn't, because Donald Trump was colluding with China over dirt for Joe Biden that he did receive, and over trade deal aid and a photo op of a deal that wasn't good for the United States, which he also received. All of that comes from just 12 to 15 sources. And then the China chapter, of course, is dozens of pages that then connects that up with hundreds of sources.
That was riveting. That was riveting. I mean, it was truly riveting, and folks, like, that's what the experience is like of reading the book. I mean, I can just tell you personally, I'm just, I'll stand in for this call as like the average guy, but like a few of those things I remember. Obviously, I remember Trump saying publicly on the White House lawn, like, I want China to get me dirt on Joe Biden. I remember details about how, our slow response to the virus and everything like that. But like this thing about Pillsbury that was covered by the Financial Times, as you said, never heard of it. And there's just those pieces. And then like the rest of the details that you just went through, I'm just like, oh yeah, right. Oh yeah, that thing. But then this conclusion that you come to, it's sort of like not surprising at all, but was in no way in my consciousness because the information hadn't been synthesized. And I think that's the point, right?
And can I mention something, Mark?
Yeah.
I think what a lot of readers have told me is the experience that you just had is the experience that they have, which is the book is simultaneously shocking, but also not shocking, right? There are no major leaps of logic or flights of fancy in this book. You actually end up looking at the data and you say, oh, I mean, of course, that's obviously what happened. I don't really have any doubt about it, because look at the events and look at their the timeline that they were put on, look how they're connected. And so that's another one of these generative paradoxes that I think the book tries to produce. It's shocking, but simultaneously not shocking at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. And so a couple other questions on the book, and then we're going to get to some current events and some audience questions. But, another experience I had in reading the book, and I think I've just kind of read enough of the comments that are made on, Amazon about your work and read reviews and so on. I think other people have the same experience as me, is that it is frankly so shocking and overwhelming that you discover again how numb you have been. I mean, me personally, and I think a lot of people sort of, they tune it out because there's just so much of this news coming at us. It's impossible to process it. And I think that there has been an effective attack by Trump on the mainstream media. This is not a controversial thing to say. This is like an open strategy of his to discredit the mainstream media and big institutions like the kinds that you draw on. And I just wonder what your feeling is as a journalist and having been the person kind of having put all this together. Do you feel like there's anything that can break through the numbness? Do you feel that, for example, your book is in some ways an antidote to the numbness, and in some way people will see all these things formatted in this way and then wake up and say, like, wow, this is really shocking and distressing?
I mean, the hope, candidly, is that reading the books in the Proof series will, among many other things, cause us to realize how much garbage we're being fed daily. Not that that's the focus of this work. The focus is actually on what we can do generatively with reliable investigative journalism. But you implicitly understand that so much of what you watch on, let's say, cable news, is talking heads giving brief sound bites about topics that they're not really expert on, and just sort of something to say that will be provocative. And you can watch talking heads all day and it's not nourishing. You're not actually being informed. By the same token, when you're on social media, you're hearing a lot of nonsense, a lot of people just spitballing their opinions, all day long. There's so much in the news that we consume that is not informative, that is not nourishing, that we fundamentally don't admire, that doesn't make us feel empowered in any way. But the goal in these books is to say that's not because the nourishing, long form, reliable major media investigative journalism from around the world and going back decades doesn't exist. It exists. It just needs to be put in one place so that you can have a simultaneously, if you will, I'm going to stretch the metaphor, a delicious and nutritious meal that is both at once, right? You enjoy eating it because you know you've been eating so much garbage that you're excited to be having something that's nutritious, but it's also delicious because it actually has content. It actually has something that makes you feel full, not just mentally, but hopefully emotionally, because now you feel empowered to have a better understanding of what's happening. I routinely have readers of the Proof series write me and say, I feel like I better can handle the slings and arrows of the daily news because I have a context and a background to it. There's a bottom to it, to use an audio metaphor, that didn't exist before. And so it makes me feel more in control than it did before. So yeah, I hope it'll be an antidote in that way.
Oh, I agree, and I just think there's so much kind of like heat and light kind of on the surface. And there's like, I mean, like Bob Woodward's book comes out, and then you have like 2 news cycles about how Trump said he was downplaying the coronavirus early on, and like that is a major scoop, and it's very important information. But like that's 2 news cycles talking about a single data point in a vast context, some of which is included in that China scenario that you laid out earlier.
Well, and if I can briefly say, Mark, I mean, just to be candid, to give people a little bit of a view behind the curtain, the way nonfiction political journalism works fundamentally is that many authors are pitching to publishers the idea that they're going to write a book that will have 4 or 5 really newsworthy pieces of information that will be covered by major media, cause major media to want to interview the author, and the result will be enormous sales for the publisher. Literally, authors create a sort of prospectus for the publisher, and they say, here are the 4 or 5 things that matter in my 400-page book. I don't work that way. I don't write that way. I want every sentence in the book to be valuable, to be informative, to be nutritious, as it were, for the reader. So to be honest, when my publishers, and I've had 2 for the Proof series, have asked me, you know, what are the 4 or 5 things? I want to say, read the book. I mean, every sentence is intended to have that impact. But I've also directly said to them, I've said to my agent, I've said on Twitter, I don't think political journalism in a national emergency should be under the old model of selling people a book that has 2 or 3 newsworthy tidbits. And I have enormous respect for Bob Woodward and others who are writing in the conventional political journalism mode. But sometimes I do think there's a criticism out there that's valid, that what you're getting is a small number of newsworthy tidbits that sometimes are scandal, sometimes they're just gossip. You know, so-and-so says the president is stupid. Okay, I mean, that doesn't really move the ball. That's not really informative or news. It doesn't change anything, but it'll make a news cycle. The Proof series is not geared towards the 24/7 corporate media news cycle. It's geared towards handling data in a national emergency.
Yeah, and just to pivot, I mean, I think one of the great skills Trump has in the way that he treats the media is he is just so masterful in creating these distress signals on the surface that are extremely distracting and extremely controversial. And then meanwhile, there's just this whole other series of events kind of going on, these deep currents below the surface that people aren't paying attention to. Look, I want to get to a few current events questions, and then I have like a stack of questions I got to get to from the audience here. But just quickly, 2 issues that you've been very passionate about, and frankly, quite insightful about, are the passing of Justice Ginsburg, and then also the upcoming election and the fact that will it be free and fair or not. And so first, just as briefly as you can on Ginsburg, you were one of the first to talk about potentially Democrats stacking the court if they would gain control of Congress in January. I just want to give you credit for that. It was one of the first places that I saw that idea. But I just, in a nutshell, explain to me the calculus on both sides here, and do you have an opinion right now in this fast-moving story about who is going to end up the winner here in whatever way you want to define victory?
So, of course, the passing of Justice Ginsburg is a national tragedy. The hypocrisy of Republicans in trying to put someone forward 45 days before an election when they opposed President Obama doing it 256 days before an election is obscene. The hypocrisy is obscene. It's on a level we haven't seen before, but all that kind of is just part of the landscape. There's nothing that can be done about it. I think fundamentally the Republicans are looking to the lesson of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. They're seeing that as ugly as those hearings were, they took two lessons from it. Number one, they won. Number two, it energized their base substantially. I think Donald Trump, much more so than Mitch McConnell, wants to have the confirmation hearings before the election to whip up his base at the opportunity of a 6-3 majority. I think the Democrats would have to do something extraordinary, like start impeachment proceedings against Bill Barr or a second impeachment against Donald Trump in order to stall the confirmation, because impeachment proceedings go first in the Senate over confirmation hearings. I don't think they'll do that because they think the political price is too high. That's Donald Trump's calculus in doing this prior to the election, which means you'll end up with a 6-3 majority conservative court where two of the seats were flat out stolen in an abuse of power by Republicans. It will, I think, force Joe Biden, if he wins in November, to add seats to the Supreme Court, not as a power move, but as redress for two stolen seats in a historical obscenity that will be a stain on the Republican Party for the next 100 or more years.
Right. Is it fair to say, though, Seth, that that only one of those two was stolen, because it's sort of like they could give Democrats Merrick Garland and then keep Ginsburg for themselves, but they couldn't have both. Is that a fair way? Because to say they stole two, sure, it's really just one.
Well, here's what I would say. Yep. The average time of a confirmation hearing is 72 days. So realistically, when a justice passes away tragically this close to an election, you actually would not expect to be able to have a vote prior to the election. You would expect that to happen in the transition. So it's two stolen seats if Joe Biden wins the presidency, because fundamentally, I don't think you would allow the loser of a presidential election to get a vote on their nominee. I think everyone would have agreed on that, including Democrats back in 2016. And so, yes, if Donald Trump wins, it's one stolen seat. If Joe Biden wins, I think you can account it to be two stolen seats. But yeah, that's a fair correction.
Okay. All right. So, you have been sounding an alarm bell, and folks, this is the last question I'm going to ask before I get to audience questions. You've been sounding the alarm bell about the election coming up in November. So it's fair to say that Trump is saying that this will be a corrupt election, a fraudulent election. He's very open about that. He said that the election that he won 4 years ago was fraudulent without evidence. He then, and I say without evidence simply because he created his own commission to investigate fraud, and it found none. But he still said that there was fraud in that election that he won. So certainly if he loses, he will have just as much motivation, if not far more, to claim fraud in this election. And I think you have laid out on your Twitter feed kind of the multifaceted ways in which he is creating this storm ahead of time, and in an almost a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way. Can you just tell me kind of a couple points there about what is most alarming to you, and how can we be sure that this will be a fair election?
Well, you would think that Donald Trump's tell in being a fraud, no pun intended, on the matter of voter fraud would simply be the fact that he routinely claims it without any evidence. But I think we actually have something more now. We have Donald Trump spending weeks predicting that this will be a fraudulent election, then going to North Carolina and urging North Carolina voters to commit felony voter fraud. So if someone is absolutely concerned about voter fraud in the same way he claimed to have been concerned about fraud in Ukraine, which I can tell you wasn't true either, he was working with the most corrupt people in Ukraine, and then he tries to create fraud, you know that he is running some sort of a long con. And the long con here is to say that this will be a fraudulent election, then to make it so. It doesn't matter whether it's Democratic or Republican voters who commit voter fraud. If there's any voter fraud, even voter fraud that he incited, he will say, see, I told you it was fraudulent. And what was fraudulent was mail-in balloting. Look, it's election night. I won in live voting. I already told you that we shouldn't take into account mail-in ballots. I'm declaring victory. I'm the winner of this election. If there's any victor declared in mid-November, that's a fraudulent declaration, and I will go to court to fight it. And state GOP officials will make sure that those slates of state electors are not sent to Washington at the beginning of January. If he's successful in that effort in the Supreme Court and with state secretaries of state, then in early January, no one will have gotten to 270 electoral votes. The vote will be sent to the House. You vote in the House by House delegation, not by member of the House. And the number of House delegations is actually in favor of the Republican Party, even though the Democrats control the House by members. As a result, Donald Trump could win this election in the House of Representatives if no one reaches 240. His clear goal is to ensure that no candidate gets to 270 electoral votes in this election.
And Seth, that is just, totally shocking. But I just almost can't even stomach that idea, but it seems like an idea that I ought to start stomaching. Can you explain what recourse anybody who is concerned about fair elections would have to fight this scenario now, or begin fighting or stopping the scenario now? I mean, one would assume that there's, at least in the Biden campaign, if not fair-minded people elsewhere, who would want to ensure that this doesn't happen, and probably minds greater than ours are already at work on these types of scenarios. But just tell us your take on what can be done now to try to stop this from happening.
I mean, I think the most important thing, of course, is to vote. The second most important thing is to vote as early as you can, to make sure that your vote can be counted as early as possible. So Donald Trump doesn't have this claim that votes that were received, on election day are still being counted 8 days later. We don't want to overload the system with so many votes that the counting takes so long that Donald Trump can insert this fraudulent rhetoric that mail-in ballots are somehow not valid. But I would further say that we've had elections in the past, that was in the 19th century, where slates of electors were sent to Washington, even though they had not been formally certified. So one administrative or legislative or congressional avenue that may still be open is for Democrats who control the House to actually seat slates of electors that otherwise were blocked or attempted to be blocked by GOP secretaries of state in key states, so that actually we could get slates of electors who show up in Washington through something other than the formal process, but they get seated anyway by the Democratic House. The problem is that Donald Trump would be contesting this the entire way through the courts up to the Supreme Court, and that underscores another reason why he needs that vote before the election, because he needs a 6-3 rock-solid conservative majority for all the frivolous suits that he's going to file if he loses this election in November. And that's what I worry about, is this, it's ultimately going to end up in the Supreme Court. That's why he has to have this justice really prior to the lawsuits beginning after Election Day.
Wow, so much to unpack there, but I do want to, we got a few minutes left here for questions, and I want to get to that. So I've got a bunch of questions that are sort of the same ilk, and I want to synthesize them here for you, which is just sort of about why the mainstream media either doesn't cover the news in the way that you're covering it, and a lot of these questions are asking, you clearly have some fans in the audience here, why you in particular are not given a platform, or your books aren't given more of a platform in the mainstream media. There's some cynicism and some skepticism in the wording of some of these questions about the motives of the mainstream media and so on. I don't want to particularly go there, but that's the general question for you.
Well, I think there are two possible explanations, and I'll try and be as candid as possible. One is a personal one. I'm a cantankerous person. I criticize media a lot. That doesn't make you a lot of friends, and I think I have to own that, right? That when you criticize media a lot, it becomes harder to say to media, yeah, but you should listen to me. Now, having said that, as a professional, and I'm a professional as a professor, as an editor, as an attorney, part of being a professional is that you don't make decisions on an emotional basis. So if you're working as a news editor and you say, Seth Abramson's kind of annoying, he's too cantankerous, I'm not going to have him on, you're not being a professional by the very definition of what it means to be a professional. So you really have to make the decision about whether you're going to expose your listeners or your readers or your viewers to metajournalism on the facts, not based on who's doing the metajournalism. And on that score, I think, as I mentioned before, journalism generally is a little bit stuck in the 20th century. Journalists tend to believe that the only thing that doesn't need to be networked in 2020 is their own work product. And if someone comes along and says, look, we need metajournalists, we need an overlay atop the conventional journalism that's happening, a lot of journalists see that as threatening, insulting. They see it as affecting their career prospects. They wonder about what their place will be in the landscape. And look, what I would say is I'm sympathetic to that, but this is a national emergency. If you're going to act like a professional in a national emergency, You put beside your own career concerns, you put beside your own emotional distaste about someone criticizing you, and you do your job. And doing your job, honestly, is giving significant airplay to whatever the most nutritious news content is. And my own self-aggrandizing opinion is that right now it's the proof series, at least on the question of Donald Trump's foreign policy.
Right. There's some other questions in here just about, meta-journalism as a technique and like how new is it? I mean, it's not like they're not trying to say that you're misrepresenting it, but there's more the thread of these questions are like, haven't all great journalists in the past been meta-journalists in some way? And it's like, you're not just a scoop machine. You are synthesizing and using some of these techniques. Can you just explain the difference between, like, to some extent, the way this has already existed, but maybe it's been carried to a different degree with yourself?
So there's certainly an intensification of processes that have always existed. If you think about historians, right? Historians obviously do a lot of research, and then they write a book that is informed by a large number of sources. I do think there are two elements that are in play here. One is the scale. The number of sources is greater than ever before in the history of historians or journalism. And the amount that I take from each source is smaller than anyone would conceive of normally taking, because we have so much information and so much to get to, because it's the digital age. So I do think that is a sort of, big part of it. But another part of it is certainly, temperamental, which is that meta-journalism fundamentally is theory-driven in the way that I said about connecting stories that are far-flung, that are not currently speaking to each other. And I think we see in conventional journalism today an absence of that awareness of work from the archive and work that is in other countries. But also, I just want to note this, and this is the most important piece of that. Meta-journalism is writing history in real time. The subjects I cover in Proof of were things that were happening on the days that I wrote about them. COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, the election, Trump-China collusion. That method of trying to write history in real time, I can tell you, if you've ever done it, it's terrifying, it's draining. It is not what historians do. It is not what journalists do, but it is necessary when you have this sort of national emergency. So yes, both the context and the history and the method are in some cases a matter of degree, but there are ways in which it's actually a difference of kind rather than degree.
Got it. Great. All right. And just, I want to just put to bed one thing. There was a question from the audience about using opinion pieces that appear in like big newspapers versus using hard news. To me, that distinction is pretty clear, but can you just explain about how something that would appear in an opinion piece would or would not make it into your work?
So I do make that distinction in the book. I also make it transparent, and you can actually click on links in the endnotes to see exactly what I'm using. There are moments in the book where what I'm trying to register is the reaction that is happening to a given event, so that people can understand, just with a sentence, right? Not with a whole paragraph or a page, but just with a sentence, what is the reaction that a certain action is met with. In most cases, I'm focusing on what's the reaction within Donald Trump's own party, or what's the reaction among medical experts. Sometimes it's the reaction among journalists, but that's actually very rare. And that's useful to create a sort of counterweight to something that's been said or done that otherwise would have no context. So if Donald Trump says something about COVID, you might actually link to one or two op-eds that were written by medical experts. People think op-eds are purely opinion-based and not based in fact. But actually, you can't publish an op-ed piece or a column unless you're working with factual material.
This is a great point. This is a very important point. Yeah.
I teach digital journalism. I teach 36 different modes of journalism. A lot of people think reporting is the only thing that qualifies as journalism, but it's not, because there is a journalistic ethos and ethics that runs across many different subgenres. You can't write columns or op-eds in which you're making up facts. But yes, it's true that that's different from reporting. But I just think sometimes when people ask that question, they're assuming that anything that's an op-ed piece can't contain information in it. It can't contain facts in it. Well, just imagine a medical expert writing an op-ed on COVID, and you'll see that that's not true.
Yeah. All right. So one last question from the audience, sort of funny. Somebody said, can Seth please write the emergency impeachment articles?
Well, I mean, I will say that. I'll say this. Did I have, when I was writing this, a lot of journalists reach out to me? Did I have people in politics reach out to me to try to get my perspective on what was happening just from a background standpoint, not my opinion, but just to say, tell me what you know about this subject because you seem to know more than others because you're a meta-journalist, not because I'm a great genius. And the answer is yes. Journalists from around the world reached out to me privately. Politicians in some cases reached out to me, and I will talk to anyone, Democrat, Republican, anyone from a reliable major media outlet to tell them what I know and try to be of assistance.
Great. All right. 2 quick questions, and then we got to really end at 3 for sure. These are both from me. You said you were a hopeful person earlier. Can you just tell me real quick, give me one thing that fills you with hope looking out at the landscape we're in right now?
I mean, I have to be honest and say, as you said from the last few days of my Twitter feed, hope has been hard to find, but I think we have a great opportunity for America to express its own hope, to express its values right now, because people are voting right now. The election's already started. And then also anyone who votes in person in November. So I am hopeful that this country does not want to slide into autocracy and totalitarianism. I am hopeful that people have enough self-respect to not want to be lied to over 20,000 times by their president. I am hopeful that people are hopeful about the future, because the future that Donald Trump has presented us with is incredibly dark, incredibly scary, and by the way, mostly of his own production. And so I am still hopeful that Joe Biden can win in November, not because he's a Democrat, but because Donald Trump is a historic threat to our union.
Thank you, Seth. And one last question for you. I love to ask this question to every author who comes on the show. Usually it's for fiction writers, but today I think it's appropriate with this book. Just imagine that somebody is your ideal reader. They are understanding everything in your book. They're getting your book in the way you want it to be gotten. They close that book on the last page and they walk from that reading experience. Describe for me in a word or a phrase, what is the feeling you want them to have having finished your book?
This is a national emergency. We are losing the United States, our rule of law and democracy, and every one of us has to use everything we have right now to lawfully and peacefully defend this country against what is about to happen if Donald Trump wins in November.
Wow, that is stirring stuff. And I wish we could end on a more hopeful note, but I don't know if hope is quite appropriate. I think everybody needs to get out there, as Seth said, and vote. I think Seth and I agree on this for sure, that all we want is just the opportunity for everybody to vote and have a fair election, and the will of the people shall be expressed in that way. And yes, I think that's the way that democracy works, and that's the way that everybody wants America to work. So Seth, this has just been amazing stuff. If you could just hold up the book one last time. There you go, guys. Proof of Corruption. It's the 3rd in the trilogy. They're all available for you to buy on Amazon or bookshop.org, anywhere you want to buy books. These are terrific, terrific reads, very valuable and very generative, as Seth said. Seth, it's been a real honor. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
You got it. So we'll see everybody next week on A Thoughtful Bro, 2 o'clock on Tuesdays. Tune in live. We'll see you then.